Good morning, Stephen Jacobs of Organic Farmers and Growers, and thank you for joining me for C.L.E.A.R. I'd like to ask you the same question I'd like to start with, which is, what has led you to be sitting here today talking to me?
Well, I suppose on the face of it, it's a very simple question. I was offered the opportunity and I decided to take it. But a bit deeper than that, the reason that I'm working with OF&G and we're working with C.L.E.A.R is the the need to make sure that people understand what labeling is out there and what's behind it, where we see particularly organic sitting in that sort of landscape, really. And so I would, as often as I can, take up the opportunity to get our messages across.
But I mean, by that question, I meant sort of what in your life history has led you to be working for OF&G? How did you come to be even part of the organization? What's your background?
Well, that's a big question, but it's one I have
Great.
been asked many times over the years. I've been in food and farming more or less for 30 years or so, and have worked at quite a lot of different points in the supply chain, from gardening to market gardening to broad scale agriculture. I've worked in retail and catering, distribution. So I have had quite a lot of experience, maybe jack of all trades rather than being an expert in any particular one. But if we go back to the very beginning of that journey, when I left home, I didn't know how to cook. I come from a generation and a background where my mother sort of frowned on blokes being in the kitchen at all, really. And I lived on toast and cream cakes mainly for a while, and then wondered why I kept getting ill, particularly with chest infections. And fortunately, my sister-in-law knew a lot more than I did about physical and mental health. And she suggested that I consider knocking a bit of the dairy on the head for a bit, and even looking at homeopathy. And I did, and it worked. So I think things came to a head for me. I walked into my local GP surgery, same doctor I'd had for years. He didn't even look up from the table. It was February. I had a chesty cough. He wrote me a prescription for antibiotics. So I walked out very frustrated, spoke to my sister-in-law, and I started to learn that the food we eat has a direct impact, a lasting impact on our health. And then once I started to see that I could effect positive change, so by taking dairy out of the diet for a while, I found that I was able to breathe better.
Right. So you had that classic kind of mucus production from dairy that a lot of people.
Yeah, yeah, I'd been silly and not eaten properly. And luckily, it had happened when I was quite young and had a certain amount of bounce back, I suppose.
Bigger to
Um,
recover. Yeah.
yeah. And then I ended up jump ahead a few years. I ended up working with a guy, which meant that I ended up in a warehouse in London, part of Community Foods. And some people will know who Community Foods are. They have a warehouse now, but they had one on Brent Cross, just off the Junction 1, I think it is, at the M1. And you walk into this place and you are faced with pallets in towers of some of the finest food in the world. And when I say fine, I mean there were barrels of organic tamari imported from Japan. There were stacks of bags of organic long grain rice from Italy, and it went on and on and on. And
Wow.
I started to think, okay, so it's not just what I eat, it's how that food was produced. So then I started moving through the entire supply chain. I didn't mean to, I didn't have a plan. Oh, I know I'll work in everything. Um, I've just always been interested thereafter in.
And at this stage, were you a decent cook? Were you really, really like getting hands on with?
I did, eventually, yeah, I lived in Nottingham for a while and there was a big explosion of Whole Food shops. This was late 80s, early 90s. I think where we lived in Forest Fields, there were about 5 Whole Food shops within half an hour's walk of my house. And yes, there was a whole bunch of us who would have vegan bake-offs.
Right.
Can you make it started off with, can you make a chocolate cake tasty even if it's vegan? And then we realized, yes, you can. You need quite a lot of sugar, obviously. But also you need really good ingredients and you need a good recipe, and we would play with that. So years later, I'm not vegan, but I don't eat a lot of dairy or meat. I'm very careful about the dairy and meat that I do eat, careful in terms of not having a lot, and also when I do, trying as much as I can to make sure it's organic. And
Fantastic.
flavour is absolutely the thing I'm on at the moment. I don't know if you've heard any of the podcasts that Dr. Tim Spector's been involved in when he's interviewed.
Yeah, bits
He
and pieces.
talks about all that nutrition you get from spices and herbs. That's part of this 30 plants a week that you should have, he says. But it could be, that includes salt, not salt, obviously, pepper, any spice, any herb. So I try and mix play those and just enjoy the different flavor combinations. Most of the time enjoy them. Sometimes it's not always successful.
Yeah, it is incredible how when you really start digging into ingredients, even you mentioned herbs and spices, even having a better quality black pepper can elevate a dish beyond what you thought was possible. And it makes you realize just how poor quality most of the things that we come across are. And I think it can become a little obsessive if you're not careful.
Yeah, oh
But
God, yeah, definitely.
it's a healthy obsession. I think it's a healthy obsession to have.
Yeah, well, so we buy a lot of our food from Essential Trading Cooperative in Bristol. I used to work there, and it's a worker cooperative. Again, it's a big warehouse where you walk in and you are faced with some of the finest food from all over the world. Um, but also, all the oats we get are, and I think this sums up for me where I'm at the moment, all the oats we get in this house are from Essential. Their organic oats are all bought through a supply chain from Organic Arable, who
Mm.
is a collective of about 60 odd farmers, all UK based. All of their oats goes to a mill in just outside of Belfast called Whites mill it, keep it separate, send it back to the UK. And Essential Trading is one of the very few places where I know not only can I guarantee that the oats are organic, but they're British. They've not
Right.
been mixed with any imported oats, which is fine. Importing oats is fine. I'm not against it. It's just I want to support UK growers. So it's just a brilliant win-win.
It sounds like a really very well tracked supply chain, which is another thing that's increasingly difficult to come up against at the moment. And I think particularly with arable crops, is I've always been surprised talking to farmers how few arable farmers have ever tasted something they've grown. Because
It's a common problem, actually. And if you go to a dairy farmer's house and you open the fridge, I
sure, yeah,
guarantee you there will be a jug of milk in there. But a lot of the other stuff, yeah, could be from all sorts. Some will also have a garden, and they'll do a small sort of market
like a
garden
market
for
garden or
themselves.
something. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But I think oats is a great example. It's something that needs minimal processing to turn it into something that we use. But even in that minimal processing, very often the farmers are producing a commodity and it's lost in the system. So there's no way of tracing that individual product to that farm, which I think is a great pity. even it was even apparent with the business that I was involved in previously called the Ethical Butcher, which was organic and regenerative meat. Some of the farmers would have us send steaks back to them after we'd bought the animals from them via the abattoir, which I thought was crazy because they'd never actually tried what they're producing and they wanted to know how it tasted and how it's related to the land,
Sure. Yeah.
which is fascinating. I'm really encouraged to hear that, that from you, your position at OF&G is coming from a love of food and not just a sort of academic viewpoint of I find some people in this sector who are sort of disconnected from food, but they're very into the maybe land management or things like that. And I think we do need to remember that we're producing food here and have that love of food. It's encouraging.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the things that I would always want to challenge is the commodification of food. There's nothing wrong with a farmer wanting to have an income stream. There's nothing wrong with having bulk commodities. Selling oats by the ounce is not going to pay the bills. You're talking about a bulk crop. However, it can be done, like I say, this supply chain that's through organic arable, through whites, through central trading, is a fairly equitable supply chain. People are treated with respect. The land is treated with respect. And so I've got a bulk crop that I'm prepared to pay a little bit more for, perhaps, than the non-organic anonymous oats. But I know I'm getting a lot back. I'm getting a huge amount of added value. And for me, that's massively important. To look 1 or 2 years in advance is difficult, but it's important, and it's important to gauge everything in terms of, generations, lifetimes, and to try and look ahead without looking back. This was somebody famous apparently said it. I heard it a while ago that you can't look forwards if you haven't looked back, because you don't really know what you're looking at, where you've come from. And I think oats is one of those things that people have been told is a very low value product. It's not. It's immensely important. It's really important in an organic rotation,
Right.
because if your ground, you're looking at crop rotation and you want your ground to be in a good state for each crop that goes in, and for your fertility build to go in certain key points. So your clovers and your grazing livestock have to move around within that rotation. And oats are very much a key part of that, particularly for an organic grower.
How come? What do oats bring? But what do they do within that cycle that's so
Well,
important?
they aren't a wheat. They're less hungry for nutrient than wheat is. Or maybe that's the wrong way of saying it. They're more able to pull nutrient up themselves. They maybe need a different ratio or spec to, for instance, a milling wheat. So if you've got a really top milling wheat of a modern variety, you might want to put that in as a first wheat.
Mm-hmm.
So that'll be first after the fertility build. Then behind that, you could put oats or beans, or sometimes both. And then also, you're looking for other things to go in the rotation. So, for instance, I know it's sometimes people argue about how you say it. It's either quinoa, quinoa, or whatever. But if you put that in your rotation, if you're successfully growing it, and it needs a very loose soil, it doesn't like too much acid. But if you are successful, you're putting in something that isn't a wheat. It isn't technically a cereal. So again, you're getting a slightly different hit on your soils from a nutritional perspective, but also it changes its profile to disease and susceptibility to disease, etc., etc.
Got you. And of course, some of the things you mentioned there are fixing nitrogen and other parts when the body of the plant is left, we'll be adding phosphorus, nitrogen, and carbon to the soil. But so I think it's probably really good time now to ask you what a really basic question, but what is organic and how is OF&G maybe slightly different to some of the other organic certifications, such as the Soil Association? Is
But
there
the first thing to say is that organic is a legal requirement. If you're selling food or drink in the United Kingdom, anywhere, then you are legally bound to have a valid certificate to substantiate that claim. So
yep,
if you write the word organic on the packet, you
legal
have to
document?
substantiate it. There are very few incidences of fraud over the years, but one or two of them have resulted in prison sentences being handed out.
Wow.
So it is a criminal act to break that law. So that's one thing. So then there's a set of regulations around that prohibit you, for instance, from using synthetic fertilizer, herbicides, etc. Um, and then there's a set of things you must do, like have a crop rotation, extensive livestock, etc., etc. But organic is more than just a set of standards. It's based on principles that are looking to cycle nutrients. So you're cycling rather than constantly bringing in inputs. And that cycling, as we said, it could be clovers, beans, livestock, and so on and so on, compost, and always bringing things back onto the farm, understanding that you're exporting when you sell your crop.
So to kind of surmise that, you're creating a system that is self-perpetuating, but allows you to harvest, to take some nutrients from the system as an excess, but not to the detriment of the system itself.
Yes, ideally.
Right.
And it's always a balancing act. You're balancing against the pressures, economic pressures, and also meteorological pressures, because the seasons will do all sorts to you. We had the winter seemed to go on through the spring this
It
year.
did this year.
And people were getting concerned. Luckily, a lot of the plants seem to have caught up, but we'll find out at harvest time if there was a hit on any of not just yield, but also in the quality of some of the crops. So when you tinker with your rotation, which could be 5, 6 years of rotation, you're thinking, can I change it slightly, knowing that it might not be like this weather-wise next year? It could be more dry, it could be wetter. How am I best able to make my farm more resilient? So if I can put more, for instance, more plant fiber composted and put into the soil, helps you retain more water and
Yep.
also withstand not just drought but flooding.
Sure.
So it's those kind of activities that sort of inure you to some extent. You're not immune, but hopefully you're a little bit more
Resilient.
elastic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. When I was hearing you talk there, it also made me realize that what must be different from conventional farming is that it's more reactive. So, I've seen, I've spoken to some conventional farmers who literally have dates in their diary going for the next however many years of this is plant, this is harvest, this is whatever, and it's quite kind of rigid, and you kind of get what you're given. But the way you were describing it there, it's more of a sort of ebb and flow with looking at what's happening with the variance in the seasons and the climate and the fact that
No, definitely.
spring is
Yeah.
different.
Well, one farmer said to me that one of the reasons why they liked going organic, so that went organic for various reasons, a lot of them is an economic imperative. The inputs that they've been using are not cheap. And of course,
Yep.
recently I've seen a massive increase in price, fertilizer notably, but others as well. But also they were found themselves sitting on a chemical sprayer at 3:30 in the morning because the agronomist has said you've got to do X and Y over this period of time. You'll lose this percentage off of that baseline, etc. And now they see their kids go to school.
Right.
So that I said, so you could say organic puts the fun back into farming. And they said, yeah, yeah. But those challenges are not always easy. I'll give
Yep.
you another example. was talking to Mark Lee, who farms a Green Acres farm in Shropshire, where we were last week for the National Organic Conference. And Mark grows, he's part of the organic arable collectives. So some of the oats I eat may well have come from his farm. But also, Mark is the Carlin pea grower for Hodney Dodds. So if you've not heard of Hodney Dodds,
I
it's
love
a
Hobler
small
Dodds.
business in
Yeah,
east of England. Yeah,
yeah,
brilliant business.
yeah,
All
yeah.
British stuff. They do not buy from abroad. And they work with their farmers in a very respectful way. It's not just about the money, it's about the long-term relationship. And Mark said to me, Hodney Dodds contacted him once to say, a person had contacted them to say, can they pass a message back to the grower of the Carlin peas? What was the message? Well, the message was that this chap had been eating hot Carlin peas out of a cup with his son round the bonfire on bonfire night, just like he did when he was a kid with his own father, and he wanted to thank the farmer. And I said, oh, that's wonderful, but it doesn't pay the bills, does it? Mark looked at me and he said, no, it doesn't. But when the rain's coming at you sideways, it helps.
Yeah. Wow, lovely. Yeah,
So,
yeah,
and I like that idea that food and farming is a shared cultural experience. And we know that when we sit around the table together. But I think that image of that man and his child standing around the bonfire, I've never met the guy, I don't know what he looks like, but I can see it in my head. I can get with that. That's a really good. And Mark was saying it's those sort of that level of relationship that helped him understand that he is no longer a commodity producer. He was growing food for people.
that's fantastic. Yeah, what you just said there really resonated with me. I've been going to Groundswell Festival for a few years, and I've always found there's a little bit of a disconnect between food and farming in some ways. So there's a lot of farmers who I think are producing a commodity, and there's that when things reach a certain scale, there is a sort of lack of connection between agriculture and food, which sounds like a strange thing to say, but the more connections we can get like that, I think the better, and the more reverence we have for the ingredients.
Definitely.
So sorry.
I was just going to say, I had a chat with John Cherry one of the nights at Groundswell. You know, everybody sort of hangs out near the
Yeah.
earthworm arms and those bales of straw. We've all got a beer, and it was a nice evening. And I said to him, again, more organic farmers coming. It's brilliant. I said, you've got farmers from all over the world, farmers doing things this way, doing things like. He said, yeah, it's become this Venn diagram of where people come together. And it was a real, I think it's no longer seen as okay to throw slings and arrows at each other. I think farmers and others in the food system can stand shoulder to shoulder. That might sound a bit hippie or whatever, but I think it's really true. And those relationships, those economic as well as cultural norms, must be challenged, and they can be successfully challenged by those relationships and the strength of those relationships.
No, I completely agree. And you've kind of neatly led me into my next question, which might be a little combative, but I really want to dig into this with you. Is we were talking about Groundswell, which of course bills itself as a regenerative agriculture conference festival. So the $1 million question to you is organic regenerative?
Organic is the first regenerative agricultural standard, and the phrase actually regenerative organic or organic regenerative was coined by Mr. Rodale decades ago in America. And they wrote a set of standards, and I believe it was called regenerative organic. So it's nice to see, it's good to see people using these terms and starting to understand that there is an association between the ecology you're growing the food in and how you grow that food. I'd like to see more acknowledgement of the work that organic farmers have been doing, some of them for decades. We've got farmers right across the country with the largest certified organic land in the UK. We've got people who've been with us since for 20, 30 years. And they are really successful at what they do in the context of regenerating their soils. But they do it because they are mandated to work within the organic regulations.
Right.
So again, coming back to what I said at the top of this, if you're saying you are something, how do you substantiate that? And I think that is a question that a lot of people are trying to sort of grapple with at the moment.
Absolutely. And this really is going to lead me into another train of thought where my understanding of the term regenerative, when it's separate from organic, is that it's an outcome based measurement. And I've seen certifications for regenerative, for example, that will allow the use of glyphosate because they're measuring soil carbon. They're not really looking at maybe an agroecological approach to the health of the soil, but they're saying, well, if we're increasing carbon in the soil, it's regenerative. But they're doing that through killing off cover crops with glyphosate and then saying they're being regenerative, which I think is disingenuous at best and actually, worse at worst. And I have a fear and a bit of a prediction. At the very, very beginning of when we started talking, you made it very clear that the term organic is a legal definition that is fraudulent if it's used incorrectly. I think we have a big problem at the moment that regenerative isn't. And I foresee a wild west of people using the term regenerative with very little metrics to back it up. How do you see this playing out? How would you like to see it playing out?
Yeah, I think it is a concern. It should be a concern for everybody. I don't want to see people getting led up the garden path. And I say that of farmers too. If farmers are being told, oh, well, this will work, great. But ask yourself the question, how do you substantiate all of the claims? And to benchmark carbon and all the rest of it is really difficult. That is a big challenge for all of us. We have that challenge too. But there needs to be confidence in the marketplace or you don't have a market. That's the backstop. At the moment, we've got a situation where food is a tradable commodity. With any tradable commodity, there's always, since forever, there's been, for instance, is it really gold? And will I have a touchstone in order to be able to check that your gold is as good as I think it is? Right the way, to food, is your salt as salty as I'd like? Is your beer clean? It was under a royal edict to make sure that the water that made the beer was clean. We had this all the way through our cultures around the planet. And now we have a system of regulatory framework that is supposed to be there to complement the marketplace. Is regenerative able to stand up to that level of scrutiny? And how do shoppers gain information quickly whilst they're browsing the shelves in the shop? So those are questions I think regenerative will need to ask of itself, and it seems to be a very many-headed hydra. There's all sorts of different versions of regenerative.
Yep.
But there's really one set of organic standards that are agreed around the world. There are differences. The USDA recently started to look at accepting hydroponics, or we reject that.
Yeah.
We would reject GMOs because it's an invasion of the cell. Same reason we would reject new GMOs under the phrase genetic editing. It's more about the system rather than the product. So organic works because we audit the entire system from seed to shelf. And it's that system that is a whole approach. And when you have an holistic approach, in theory anyway, you're working towards some sort of gestalt where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts because there's synergies, harmonies, etc. And that is truly regenerative, in my view.
That's very brilliantly put. I really enjoyed that. That's yeah.
I've had a bit of practice talking about this stuff. I
No,
hope it doesn't.
that was
My
wonderful.
voice isn't all monotone.
No, I could tell. I could tell this is something that you've thought about very deeply, and that was very beautifully articulated. Thank you. So before we kind of jump into labeling and the reason that you support C.L.E.A.R, I'd like to kind of just touch on the Food Data Trade Board and the organic sector. And can you tell me a bit about Planet Score, which I believe is a French accreditation, and just give me your thoughts on that, because I believe there's been some alignment there. So what's happening in France that is maybe a little better than what is happening in the UK in terms of labeling?
It's about product environment footprint labels, PEFs, and Planet Score seems to our colleagues on the continent in IFOAM, so that's the International Federation of Organic Agriculture Movements, which we're a member of the international group, which has been going for many, many decades, and we are thereby also members and very active members of the European wing, which is IFOAM Organics Europe. In Europe, our colleagues have looked at various environment footprinting labels and found them to be lacking.
Right.
There have been several papers actually on the misrepresentation of, for instance, agroecological food production with these life cycle analyses. They tend to be one up, one down in terms of the view of the life cycle.
Sorry,
which
could
is
you explain what that means? One up, one down.
So if you're looking at, for instance, the carbon or greenhouse gas emissions of glyphosate, or you could look at glyphosate, you would look at how it's produced and measure the thermal energy needed, but you're not really looking at how that whole system has embodied energy. So that would be 2 or 3 up. And also you're not looking at contamination, for instance, of the water supply, which could be 2 or 3 down.
The sort of scope of impact, if you like.
Yeah, and it's tricky to do, and it could be very, very expensive. The way forward, I think, just to quickly throw in a quick policy ask here, is that we have an integrated food and farming policy. It's something that Tim Lang has been calling for a very long time, and we still haven't seen. Henry Dimbleby entered the fray more recently with that very excellent work that he did with his team, and again, the government seemed to ignore it. You need to have a consistent approach. You need to make sure it's cohesive, and you need to make sure that people understand it all. So 5 a day is meaningless. Apparently, it's according to people like Dr. Tim Spector, you need 30 a week minimum of different varieties of plant-based products, or your gut bacteria will suffer. 5 a day, people are thinking, what is that? It's odd. So can we have food and farming on the educational curriculum? And that needs to start at primary school. Do they know the difference between a carrot and a turnip? I know turnips are very popular with DEFRA at the moment. So it's that kind of approach where you have something that fits together. Retailers do not want to lose business. They don't want to lose confidence from their customers, but they're also beholden to their shareholders. Now, at the moment, we have a rather deregulated approach to the tracking of financial movement. So you as a foreign investor can move large sums of money in and out of a jurisdiction of a territory with almost no reporting mechanism requirement whatsoever. So that might be okay if you're looking at car parts, but when you're looking at items in the food system that, as we've discussed, are intrinsic to the ecology where they're produced, then I think you need to have extra levels of protection, extra levels of scrutiny.
No, I completely agree. But what, so can we go back to, I believe there's something in France where there is a lot of eco labels, and the regulation in France on eco labeling got recently quite sort of tightened up. I did a bit of a dig on this in the UK. I think in the UK there's 140 or 160, that sort of number of different eco labels, and I don't think they're properly under government regulation. And the big thing that seems to be lacking from all of them is farm data. But you will, I'm hoping you know an awful lot more about this than I do, and you can shed a bit of light on it. But didn't something happen in France with Planet Score, whereby the government are saying, if you want to make these claims on eco labels, you need to be collecting proper farm data, and that needs to be reflected in a score that follows the.
Yeah, it wasn't just Planet Score. There's the European Commission have actually made a statement as well. So they across the European Union, the member states have obligations as members, and they're saying now that if you use certain terms, you have to be able to substantiate them. So it's like over here we have the advertising standards, and they will say, okay, substantiate that claim. If the ASA will do it only if either they think there's a chance that an item is likely to mislead or there's been a complaint. So if there hasn't been a complaint, they don't necessarily have to act. Whereas in Europe now, they're saying, regardless of all of that, if you use terms like eco,
Yep.
you need to be able to support that with some kind of substantiation. There has been big moves against that from large farming and food agribusiness lobby. Yeah, but you again, we're not selling cars. We're not even just selling food. We're selling impacts on ecosystems, and I think you can't just bandy around a few words and expect to be able to then just disappear into the night. You have to be able to stand, be questioned, and face up to those challenges. And that's, thankfully, yes, that's happened in France. It's happening across Europe, and I'm really pleased to see it. One of the things that organic has had all of this time is, of course, that we're the only food label that is enshrined in the law.
Yeah, yeah.
Everything else is voluntary.
It's madness, absolute madness. And the thing about, I think, obviously one of the aims of C.L.E.A.R is that farm data needs to be collected, but farmers should be incentivized. Well, not just when I say incentivized, I mean paid. They should be paid to collect the farm data by the next stage in the market chain. So by the producer, but sorry, by the, yeah, and
well, that's what they do in France, and L'Agence Bio do that for the organic sector, and they are paid by the government to collect data that incentivizes growers to supply data to make sure it's clean data, so it's usable, to make sure it's consistent against a set of methodologies. We do report here; it's part of the organic regulation, so all of the organic control bodies must report to DEFRA every year the previous year's statistics,
right,
and then DEFRA produce a report. So, for instance, the amount of hectarage that's under our certification, everything from the crops that they're growing through to how many farmers there are. And then DEFRA crunch those numbers and spit out a report. What we'd like to see is better use of data. Really. For instance, we do a biodiversity survey of our farmers, but then what do we do with it? I've talked to the RSPB and others, and they're keen to work with us on things like that. I'd like to see more from industry supporting things like that. There is RSPB are the ones I think are probably leading on that, and WWF, of course, with their basket. It's about how we, as I said earlier, how we all sit around the table and talk about whatever the benchmarks are.
Yeah.
And we can be different from each other. That's okay, as long as we know where the benchmarks are.
That's super interesting. So we have a system which is kind of working in France, which is largely what the C.L.E.A.R campaign is advocating for, which is farmers collecting real meaningful data at a farm level. They're being paid to do that by the next stage up in the supply chain, and that's being mandated by government. I mean, that's pretty much what because the government is saying if you want to make eco claims, it has to be backed up with facts and figures. That's a working model of what C.L.E.A.R is basically advocating for to happen.
Absolutely. And the French Court of Auditors, now these are mostly economic analysts, came out last June, last year, not this year, with a statement to say that if the French government want to actually deliver on their ambition of nature and climate change, then support organic farming. Because they looked at the metrics, and as we just said, they've got good data, and they said you could deliver more for the land, more for the people, more for health, more for water, if you support organic more. Because it's there, it's working, we've got the metrics to show that it's effective in terms of biodiversity and carbon, so support it. And those are economists. This is not Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth.
That's pure data number crunching. There's nothing emotional or evocative about it. It's a pure facts and figures, which is for some people that's what needs to happen to make that work.
Yeah, oh, definitely. And I think it's things like that. There are more and more things like that happening around Europe, around the world. The Scottish government have now said there'll be a food commissioner, which is a really good step forward. I don't think they've chosen anybody yet, but the idea is that you'll be able to then submit proposals to their food commissioner for food integrated into policy. The Welsh are looking at a similar thing because they've got a food bill that the Senate are looking at, I think, at the moment. And the British government, the UK government, the Westminster government have said they're not interested. So I think that's a shame. I think it's a missed opportunity. And I'd like to think in the next parliamentary term, we'll see people being a little bit more mature about how they approach it couldn't be a more fundamental challenge is how do we secure good food through the next few decades?
Yeah, I mean, you've almost kind of led into my, to my wrap up there, which is, of course, what's your, give me an optimistic prediction for the future. If you're putting your glasses half full hat on and thinking where could we be, what positive changes could happen? Where have you seen things moving in the right direction? And with your optimistic hat on, what does 20 years from now look like?
I am optimistic. I think it's important. You've got to keep optimistic. I say that there are points in the day when you're dealing with one agency or another where you start to wonder. But generally speaking, we're seeing quite a wave of optimism amongst the organic community, particularly, but also with other communities. I work with a bunch of people under the banner of UK Grain Lab, and we started that maybe 10 years ago or something with people. So Kimberly Bell from Small Food Bakery, who has been absolutely superb at being able to put the farmer, the food, and the shopper in one narrative. Absolutely superb. And that was building on the work of Professor Martin Wall, sadly no longer with us, but Martin's composite cross population, the Wakelins population, which was, he bred those wheats with support from the Organic Research Centre and the John Innes Centre in order to breed diversity into the field. So you've got some of the plants will be short, some will be tall. You end up with a very nutritious wheat, but who's going to mill it? Because it's not the usual milling spec.
Right.
So Josiah from Hodme Dodds found a mill, sent some flour to Kim at Small Food Bakery. Kim worked out how to produce a wonderful sourdough recipe so that you get this beautiful bread. And now, some years later, we have a very, very healthy community of farmers, millers, and bakers working together in clusters around the country. And that gives me really good feeling about where we're going, because whilst we can sometimes say that policymakers seem to be focused outside of the food system, and as I said, I think that is a missed opportunity, and I actually think it's bordering on negligence, considering the crises we're up against. We are at the same time seeing people who, one farmer said to me, he's not organic, but he's very close to it. He may go organic at some point. He said to me, he needs to be able to look the customer in the eye and say, yeah, this is what I'm saying it is. And he needs to know that everybody in the supply chain is getting a fair slice of the cake in terms of pay and recognition, because not just be for altruistic reasons, although those are good, you want to know that they're going to be there next year and the year after. And it's that building literally from the grassroots up that's working. And I'm seeing those communities grow and continue to grow, even with COVID, even with the ongoing saga of leaving the European Union in, let's face it, a rather a very inhospitable approach from the UK government has led to a very weak set of agreements, which even some in the Parliament have now attested to. So even amongst all of that turmoil, we've seen people working closer together, and thank heavens for that, because those are the people that will be there tomorrow and the next year, whereas others, I'm afraid, we're losing farmers. The Rural Business Survey reports every year, and over time you can see we're losing farmers. Farmers are getting bigger, owned by sometimes people who are not even in this country. It's an investment opportunity. They might grow lots of trees instead. We need to be able to secure food for future generations. And the British Isles is really good. It's a great place to grow food. We've got some of the best soils. Mm-hmm. We've got a really temperate climate. Yes, we've had some ups and downs with the weather, but generally speaking, it's a pretty good place to grow food. So I would like to see more people like Kim Bell and Josiah at Hodme Dodds working closer together with our farmers to build better food systems, because it really can work really, really well.
So instead of trying to change the system, it's almost like the best thing we can do is just offer an alternative and just...
I think, yeah, offer an alternative and show policymakers, show members of parliament, politicians, councillors. I'm part of a thing here in Shropshire called the Shropshire Good Food Partnership, and my colleagues on that have got other food businesses in for a Shropshire Good Food Trail. In the autumn, we're going to have the March's Real Food and Farming Conference down near Bishop's Castle at the Linley Estate. I work with people in Wales. In November, we'll be holding the 5th Wales Real Food and Farming Conference. The first one, our guests of honour, of course, were Colin and Ruth, who founded the Oxford Real Farming Conference. And these things are growing. It's brilliant. That's the way to do it. We invite the politicians along and we show them this is a really good way of delivering to a lot of your ambition. and then they can see it for themselves.
The knowledge is there, the economics work. What more do you need to know, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Swap recipes, make some good food together and share it together. It couldn't be more wonderful.
That's a wonderful way to wrap up, Stephen.
It's a bit corny, perhaps, but it's true.
No, that was a fantastic way to wrap up, and we've been rabbiting on for quite a while now. But I'm going to say thank you so much for your time, and of course, one thing I will hit you up for is if you can send me for the notes to go with this, how people who are just genuinely interested in making the planet a better place, how they can learn more about OF&G and what you're doing and get involved in supporting the forms of agriculture that you've so eloquently described today. Thank you.
Will do, certainly. Thanks, Glenn. Really appreciated the opportunity.
Thank you.